All right, welcome back, everyone. So this is video 2 of part 7, the evolutionary psychology of meaning. Let's do it. So, in the last video, we talked about meaning in life as a mood, as a long-term mood that tracks psychological integration over relatively longer periods of time. But we also talk about meaning as something that is inherent to particular experiences, right? Some experiences are meaningful and others aren't. So here we're going to talk about why it is that some experiences are felt as being meaningful while others are not. We're not going to talk about every instance of a meaningful experience here. We're going to look at 3 kinds of experiences you can have that are always felt as being intensely meaningful. These would be flow states, what Abraham Maslow called peak experiences, which are the same as what everybody has always called the mystical or the religious. It's the fundamental mystical or religious experience. And then psychedelics. Psychedelics, especially psilocybin, can reliably induce peak experiences in people. The problem with studying peak experiences is not that they're, I mean, if you've ever had one, and I have, uh, they're undeniable. You can't, if you've had it, you know what it is, and there's no getting around it. But they're hard to study scientifically because, of course, they're relatively rare, and you can't just put somebody in a room and say, okay, have a peak experience now. Except now we kind of can, because psilocybin reliably induces experiences that are like a peak experience. And so we're going to look at the empirical research around that. All of these are felt as intensely meaningful, and they all have some properties in common that can indicate to us why it is that they are felt as meaningful. In short, the short story is that all of these experiences are associated with our participation in the process by which we become more psychologically integrated over time, and that process of becoming more integrated is felt as meaningful. And so we have this instinct of meaning that tracks our participation in the process by which we become more integrated over time, right? That's the idea. The subjective sense of meaning is like a guide to guide us in our staying on that narrow path by which we become more integrated over time, which of course, by now it should be redundant to say that process occurs at the border between order and chaos. So my thesis here is that we experience the process that we've been talking about, throughout this series, this process of complexification, this process that occurs at the border between order and chaos. It's the structure of an insight. It's the structure of the metamythology, this descent into chaos and reemergence into a higher level of integration, right? A higher form of order is a higher level of integration. It's an increase in complexity. That process, our participation in that process, is felt as meaningful. This process occurs at the border between order and chaos. It involves a temporary increase in entropy and a reemergence into a higher form of order or complexity or integration. And we're going to look at how this process manifests in the flow state, in peak experiences, and in the psilocybin experience. So what is flow? Flow was introduced by this author who I can never say his name right, and so I'm not even going to try. But you can see his name there at the bottom. You can try to pronounce it if you want. He wrote this great book called Flow, and I'm just going to read a kind of summary of what this is and how it relates to meaning. He said, and I quote, that when an important goal is pursued with resolution and all one's varied activities fit together into a unified flow experience, the result is that harmony is brought to consciousness. Someone who knows his desires and works with purpose to achieve them is a person whose feelings, thoughts, and actions are congruent with one another, and is therefore a person who has achieved inner harmony. Let me stop there for a minute. This is the same thing as Maslow's self-actualization. We're going to talk about self-actualization in the next video, not in this video, but what he's describing there is the same thing as what Maslow called self-actualization. He goes on. In the 1960s, this process was called getting your head together, but in practically every other historical period, a similar concept has been used to describe this necessary step towards living a good life. Someone who is in harmony, no matter what he does, no matter what is happening to him, knows that his psychic energy is not being wasted on doubt, regret, guilt, and fear, but is always usefully employed. Inner congruence ultimately leads to that inner strength and serenity we admire in people who seem to have come to terms with themselves. Purpose, resolution, and harmony unify life and give it meaning by transforming it into a seamless flow experience. Whoever achieves this state will never really lack anything else. A person whose consciousness is so ordered need not fear unexpected events or even death. End quote. And so we see that flow is being described here in terms of psychological integration, right? Inner congruence, inner harmony, inner unity, right? That's how he is describing what flow achieves for us. And he's correct, right? I mean, this is why it's felt as meaningful, because that's what it is, the process by which we become more integrated. John Vervaeke and colleagues in I believe it was actually a 2018 chapter. I have 2010 on the screen here, but I think that was a typo. In a 2018 chapter, they conceptualized the flow state as being a cascade of insights. So Mihaly, I'm just going to call the author of the book Flow Mihaly, because I can pronounce his first name, I think. Mihaly doesn't really do much of a cognitive science analysis of the flow state. John Vervaeke and colleagues in this chapter do, and they argue that what's happening when we're in flow is that we are having a series of sort of back-to-back insights. And so this is what they say about this, and I quote that, with respect to the understanding of flow, conceptualizing the process as an extended aha moment refers to a chain-like series of instances of insight problem solving, an accelerated positive feedback loop, whereby the solving of each insight problem yields another insight problem to be solved. Flow might be understood as a cascade of transference of mental sets, each instantiation of insightful restructuring procedurally priming the agent to further engage insightfully with his or her dynamic surrounding. This moment-to-moment series of eureka events fosters a string of insightful realizations, or an extended aha. And so, I'm going to back up a minute and go back to this figure. This figure in the bottom left corner of the screen is describing the structure of an insight. And so when you were in the flow state, right? So we get into the flow state when we're working often on a valued project, on something that we really care deeply about, that is engaging our skills in the optimal way, so that it's not too easy, it's not too difficult. This can be sports. Of course, when somebody says that they're in the zone, something like that, that's the flow state. We're doing this, right? We're continually sort of having these little descents into psychological chaos and reemergence, right? So we're, and it's because we're being challenged in the right way, right? We're being challenged in the optimal way with problems that are difficult enough to challenge us, but not so difficult that we're overwhelmed by them. And when we can put ourselves in that position, we achieve the state of flow. And they make clear in their chapter that the flow state can only occur between order and chaos. They conceptualize this as boredom and anxiety, but of course that's the same thing. They say, and I quote, that there must be a dynamic match between the demands of the situation and the skills of the individual. When challenge outweighs skill, the individual develops anxiety and frustration. When skill outweighs challenge, he or she faces boredom, right? So we want to be at the border between the known and the unknown, right? If we're in a situation where we're dealing with things that we have absolutely no idea what we're doing, we're just anxious, or we just give up, right? We might as well. If you can't even get started. But if we're doing things that are too simple, we're just bored. The flow state emerges at the border between those. So this is a process by which you are continually breaking frame and reestablishing frame, which means that you are continually complexifying, which means that you are continually becoming more integrated. You're engaging in this process where you have little disintegrations, but those little disintegrations are in the service of a higher level of integration, right? You come out of those into a higher level of integration, and it's felt as being intensely meaningful. So that is the flow state. Now we're going to move on to talk about peak experiences, which are really mystical experiences, right? That's what the peak experience is. It's the same thing that's always been called the mystical experience, which William James documented in his book on the varieties of religious experience. And there are some commonalities. Of course, there are cultural differences in how this is experienced, but there are some deep commonalities as well. Maslow said about this in toward a psychology of being, that heaven, so to speak, lies waiting for us through life, ready to step into for a time and to enjoy before we have to come back to our ordinary life of striving. And once we have been in it, we can remember it forever and feed ourselves on this memory and be sustained in times of stress. End quote. This is something that's very common for people who have peak experiences. You know, people can suffer a lot in their life, and the peak experience, even though it's not exactly always felt as being comfortable, it's so meaningful that it justifies the suffering. You know, it justifies all of it. And this is a common experience, right? Even people who have had terrible things happen to them. The peak experience is, it renders life self-evidently good and justifiable. Not because it's pleasurable, but because it's meaningful. Scott Barry Kaufman wrote this book, Transcend, a few years ago. It came out in 2020. And he draws a lot on Abraham Maslow's work in this book. It's Transcend, the New Science of Self-Actualization. And so I'm going to read what he said about the peak experience in relation to Maslow. Kaufman said, and I quote, that after completing Motivation and Personality in 1954, Maslow turned his attention to a particular characteristic of self-actualizing people that long fascinated him. Many of the self-actualizing people he studied tended to sound like traditional mystics, describing unusual moments of heightened joy, serenity, beauty, or wonder. He was surprised, having begun his research under the impression that mystical experiences were rare, something that perhaps happened to one saint every century. Instead, Maslow observed that peak experiences occurred in a wide range of people and seemed to have many triggers. Whether an excellent athletic or music performance, creative experience, aesthetic perception, the love experience, sexual experience, childbirth, moments of insight and understanding, religious or mystical experience, or overcoming a profound challenge. Any experience that comes close to perfection. What's more, it seemed that the greater a person's psychological health, the greater the frequency of such experiences, the higher their height, and the greater the intensity and the illumination. Such observations inspired Maslow to generalize the experience and to strip it of its traditionally religious meaning. End quote. And so what we see is that, for one, these experiences are not extremely rare. They're not common, but they're not extremely rare. And they tend to occur in healthy people, right? So these are not, there are some very... I don't know exactly what the word is to describe these, hard materialist, I guess. I don't know. People kind of like Richard Dawkins, right? Who would think that anybody who describes what is generally described as the peak experience must be suffering from a kind of delusion. But the problem with that is that these occur in healthy people. They occur in people who are doing well in their endeavors, generally speaking. And that's not what a delusion is, right? Delusions are dysfunctional. The peak, or the mystical experience, it seems to be, it doesn't have the characteristics of a delusion, right? It seems to make people better when it happens. Maslow says about this, and I quote, that the peak experience is felt as a self-validating, self-justifying moment which carries its own intrinsic value with it. That is to say, it is an end in itself, what we may call an end experience rather than a means experience. It is felt to be so valuable an experience, so great a revelation, that even to attempt to justify it takes it away from its dignity and worth. This is universally attested to by my subjects as they report their love experiences, their mystic experiences, their aesthetic experiences, their creative experiences, and their bursts of insight. Particularly with the moment of insight in the therapeutic situation does this become obvious. By virtue of the very fact that the person defends himself against the insight, it is therefore by definition painful to accept. Its breaking through into consciousness is sometimes crushing to the person, and yet, in spite of this fact, it is universally reported to be worthwhile, desirable, and wanted in the long run. Seeing is better than being blind, even when seeing hurts. It is a case in which the intrinsic, self-justifying, self-validating worth of the experience makes the pain worthwhile. Numerous writers on aesthetics, religion, creativeness, and love uniformly describe these experiences not only as valuable intrinsically, but also as so valuable that they make life worthwhile by their occasional occurrence. The mystics have always affirmed this great value of the great mystic experience, which may come only 2 or 3 times in a lifetime. End quote. So this is what has to be understood about these experiences. They're not necessarily what you would call pleasurable. And it's not pleasure. It's the wrong way. It's meaning. And that's different from pleasure. Okay, so people often report this with childbirth, for example. Well, obviously childbirth is not pleasurable in the normal sense, right? It's very, I haven't personally experienced it, but I assume it's pretty painful. But it's also felt for many people as the most meaningful experience of their life, and it's something that that gives them a purpose, right? It gives people, having kids gives people a purpose. It integrates them, and that's very, it's very much why it's felt as meaningful. But this is often the case with these experiences, right? It's not pleasure, right? It's even though they're, it's felt as being good and and as self-justified. You wouldn't call it pleasure. That's the wrong way to think about it. Jordan Peterson described in some detail one of his peak experiences, and I'm going to read what he said about it because I think it's very interesting, and I think it demonstrates what these experiences can be like and their how intense they can be. And he had this experience while he was working on this sculpture, which is the cover of Maps of Meaning. So the cover of Maps of Meaning is a 2-dimensional representation of this sculpture, which was about, the sculpture was meant to convey the meaning of music. We're going to come back to that later on. But this is what he said about his peak experience, and I quote, "I was making this sculpture, and I spent like 4 months on it. I was thinking about it a lot, and I got it mostly assembled. And then I was in my living room in Montreal, and I was listening to Mozart's Fourth Symphony, the Jupiter Symphony, and I was really listening to it. And it's one of these complexly multi-level patterned pieces of auditory sculpture that I believe represents being, because what being is multiple levels of patterned transformation interacting simultaneously. And music is a representation of that, which is why we find it meaningful." I'm going to stop there for a second. We're going to come back to music at the end of part 7. That is why we find music meaningful. Music is a presentation of the proper harmony of obviously harmony, but of the proper way of being integrated across time, right? It's something like that. But we'll come back to that. He goes on. "Anyways, I was listening intently to this symphony. At the same time, I was concentrating on the sculpture that I have made. And all of a sudden, and everything I'm about to say is a metaphor, because there's no way of encapsulating it properly in words, but it was as if the heavens opened up about. And I was still in my living room. Yet really the experience was best represented by one of those early Renaissance paintings where you see God or Christ up in the sky with an opening in the sky against the clouds and against the sun. So it was like that, even though I didn't really see that, but it felt like that, and there was some visuals associated with it. And I felt like something descended upon me that had a personal nature. Something like a higher consciousness that was actually a being of a sort, and it filled me from the inside out. And it was enrapturing, let's say, and it was an incredible feeling. It was a divine feeling, I suppose, is the right way of thinking about it, and certainly a religious experience." He goes on to say, "And it transformed me, and it turned me into something far more than I normally was. And maybe you could think about that as an intimation of what you could become if you worked on it for the rest of your life, which is sometimes what I think hallucinogens provide people with, an image of who they could be if they shed all of their dead wood." Let me stop there for a second. That is what psychedelics do. We're going to talk about psychedelics next, but yeah, I do think that's basically what psychedelics do and why they facilitate personal transformation. He goes on, "Anyways, it was as if an offer was being made to me that I could be like that from now on permanently. And I thought, well, I don't know how to do that. I couldn't walk down the street in this elevated condition. I wouldn't belong in the world anymore. I wouldn't know how to function. I don't know how I could do it. And so the experience, this thing, say, that was communicating with me was accepted." Okay, let me back up a little bit. The experience, this thing, say, that was communicating with me was accepted that as an answer, although I would say with some sorrow, and then it receded. And then I went and talked to my wife, and I told her what had happened, and I was shaking a tremendous amount, and my pupils were completely dilated. End quote. Okay, so that's a peak experience, right? And that's, the way that people describe these things can only be described in religious language, right? I mean, of course, you sound like a mystic woo-woo person when you try to describe these things, but that's the way everybody sounds when they try to describe them. There's no other way of doing it. We don't really have the language in some sense to describe them, but that's what they are. And so I'll just leave it there. That's an example of a peak experience. Maslow regarded the peak experience as a kind of intensification of the flow state. Of course, he didn't use the language of the flow state because it wasn't around them, but that is what he argued. Essentially, he said, and I quote, that apparently the acute mystic or peak experience is a tremendous intensification of any of the experiences in which there is a loss of self or transcendence of it. For example, problem centering, intense concentration, intense sensuous experience, self-forgetful, and intense enjoyment of music or art. Well, that's just the flow state, right? It's an intensification of the flow state in some sense. Maslow also regarded the peak experience as akin to a kind of death and rebirth process. He said that the peak experience itself can often meaningfully be called a little death and a rebirth in various senses, as something akin to a climactic explosion, which then ends. And this is, with Jordan Peterson's experience, right? It was a kind of a little personal death and rebirth that he had. He said that it transformed him. They break you down in some sense and build you back in a different way. And it's something like that. That's how they're often described anyways. One of the common characteristics of a peak or mystical experience is that they are accompanied by an increased feeling of connectedness to the world, connectedness to other people, and to yourself. In addition to a sense that opposites are not really and I've had this experience. I've had, this experience of what's often been called the coincidence of opposites, right? Where you see that there are no real opposites. Everything is well, it's very hard to describe, but this is something that people who have these experiences will often say, that opposites are not really contradictory, but they're fused together into a kind of unity. Kaufman, in his book, says this about it, and I quote, that while transcendent experiences differ in various ways, they all have in common weakening of the boundaries to connectedness with others, the world, and one's own self. William James personally observed this core aspect of the transcendent experience. He said, and I quote, looking back on my own experiences, they all converge towards a kind of insight to which I cannot help ascribing some metaphysical significance. It is as if the opposites of the world, whose contradictoriness and conflict make all our difficulties and troubles, were melted into unity. End quote. And that is the experience, right? It's everything is a unity. So the most meaningful experiences that people can have are often described in terms of the unification of opposites, the connectedness of all things, the unity of the world, and so on. These are all manifestations of integration, right? These are all different kinds of integration, right? The integration of our of everything in some sense. Like that's, in the real mystical peak experience, it is as if everything is integrated into a unity, into a unified whole. And this is how mystical experiences have always been felt. So Nietzsche, in his book Philosophy and the Tragic Age of the Greeks, describes the mystical experience which underlies the intuition that everything is one. He says, and I quote, that Greek philosophy seems to begin with an absurd notion, with the proposition by Thales that water is the primal origin and the womb of all things. What drove him to this was a metaphysical conviction which had its origin in a mystic intuition. We meet it in every philosophy, together with the ever-renewed attempts at a more suitable expression, this proposition that all things are one. End quote. And so this has always been, that's always been the mystical intuition in some sense, the idea that everything is ultimately one. Everything is integrated together into a harmonious whole. So we have a constellation of ideas here, right, of the connectedness of all things, of the overcoming of opposites, the unity of opposites, and of the intuition that all is one. Right? So these are all hallmarks of what you might call the mystical experience. Of course, this has been very difficult to study scientifically because of the fact that these experiences are relatively rare. They're not extremely rare, but they're relatively rare, and you cannot usually induce them via experiment. But recently, this limitation has essentially been overcome because we can now scientifically study these things because we can reliably induce them in people through psychedelics, through psilocybin especially. Psilocybin, a large dose of psilocybin in a controlled setting, reliably induces mystical experiences in the research subjects. And these have been intensely studied for the last 15 or 20 years or so. And so we're going to look at that. So classic psychedelics, especially psilocybin, have been used recently to study the neurology and the correlates of what would have been called peak or mystical experiences. I'm going to read something that Griffiths and colleagues wrote in this 2018 paper on this kind of stuff. So they said, and I quote, that quantum change, and let me just preface this, what they're calling these experiences quantum change experiences. People like to come up with new names for these things all the time, but it's clearly the same thing, as you'll see here. So Griffiths and colleagues say, and I quote, that quantum change experiences refer to sudden, distinctive, benevolent, and often profoundly meaningful experiences that are said to result in personal transformations that affect a broad range of personal emotions, cognitions, and behaviors. The phenomenon of quantum change is differentiated from the usual process of behavioral change, which occurs in small incremental steps. Such experiences, which have been described in anecdotal reports dating back centuries, have been variously labeled as mystical experiences, conversion experiences, religious experiences, peak experiences, transcendental experiences, transforming moments, or epiphanies. Although numerous cases of such quantum change experiences have been described, they have generally not been examined in prospective experimental studies because such experiences occur at low rates and usually unpredictably. Administration of psilocybin, a classic psychedelic, provides a model for experimental investigation of quantum change experiences, end quote. So people who have these experiences under the influence of psilocybin, they tend to rate them as among the most meaningful experiences of their life, up there with the birth of a child, essentially. That's how meaningful the real psilocybin experience can be. So we discussed in part 4 how psilocybin has been argued to work by increasing the amount of entropy in the brain and moving the brain, therefore, closer to criticality, right? So criticality is that border between order and chaos. Psilocybin increases entropy because most people are slightly tilted towards order most of the time during normal waking consciousness. Increasing the entropy moves you closer to criticality. And at that border, a couple of things happen. And we're going to talk about the empirical research about this. So when you have these experiences, you have systematic insights, and they involve what are called high-level beliefs. These are beliefs about your worldview, right? These experiences can change your worldview, can change your fundamental assumptions about the nature of the world, and they do this quite often. And they also are accompanied by a profound sense of connectedness. We already talked about this in the context of the mystical or the peak experience. Psilocybin can induce this feeling of connectedness, this feeling of unity in people. So we're first going to talk about this fact that psychedelics can change people's worldview. This is an extremely interesting thing about them, a phenomenon, because generally speaking, worldviews are very difficult to change. They don't change easily, and for good reason, because it's dangerous most of the time to radically disrupt somebody's worldview. But under the influence of psychedelics, people seem to be able to change their fundamental assumptions about the world without going through what is often a process that involves an extreme amount of anxiety. Although psychedelics can definitely cause a certain amount of anxiety, depending on the context. But so we have a cognitive science theory that can explain why this happens. So Robin Carhart Harris and Carl Friston put forward what's called the REBUS model of psychedelics. REBUS stands for Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics. which is a model of what psychedelics are doing in the brain. And so we've already discussed this idea that the mind is arranged in a hierarchy of abstraction, and that what you would call worldview questions, those fundamental big questions about the world, are at the top of that hierarchy. And according to the REBUS model, psychedelics work by relaxing the precision of high-level beliefs. Precision here, for our purposes, can just be thought about as our confidence in them. It makes us more uncertain about our high-level beliefs. And so that allows for systematic insights to take place, right? So an insight is when you break a frame and then reform a frame. Well, these high-level beliefs are the deep ways that we're framing the world. And what psychedelics do is they decrease our certainty about those high-level beliefs, and they allow them to break and to reform under their influence. And so psilocybin helps people to change their deep-seated assumptions about the world, their deep-seated assumptions that make up their worldview. We're going to look at evidence for this here in a minute. So I'm going to read something that Carhart, Harris, and Friston said in this paper, kind of a summary of what's going on here, just to give you an idea of how this is talked about in the scientific literature. So they say, and I quote, that functionally, the effect of relaxing the precision weighting of high-level priors is to create a state in which these priors are imbued with less confidence. As just touched on, an important example of a high-level prior is the belief that one has a particular personality and set of characteristics and views. This umbrella belief is commensurate with the narrative self or ego. It is proposed in this work that dissolving high-level priors has implications for the functioning of the rest of the hierarchy, and indeed the integrity of the hierarchy itself. More specifically, we propose that the general entropic action of psychedelics is to render the brain or mind's variational free energy landscape flattened or opened up. It follows from hierarchical predictive coding that precise high-level priors or beliefs ordinarily have an important constraining influence on the rest of the hierarchy, canalizing lower components and inhibiting their expression and influence. A corollary of relaxing high-level priors or beliefs under psychedelics is that ascending prediction errors from lower levels of the system that are ordinarily unable to update beliefs due to the top-down suppressive influence of heavily weighted priors can find freer register in conscious experience by reaching and impressing on higher levels of the hierarchy. End quote. Okay, so you have this hierarchy of beliefs and goals and values and all of this. So what happens when you flatten it, right? And so at the bottom are the sensory prediction errors, right, that are traveling up the hierarchy. Okay, so normally the hierarchy is pretty steep, and most prediction errors get resolved at low levels of the hierarchy. That is, they don't affect the stuff at the top, right? So they don't travel very far up the hierarchy. So what happens when you flatten that hierarchy out, right? Well, that's what psychedelics are doing in some sense. That's one way of conceptualizing it. They flatten this hierarchy out, and now the prediction errors go all the way up to the top, and they affect the high level beliefs, right? These are worldview questions. And that's what happens at the border between order and chaos in the brain. They go on to say, and I quote, that we also propose that the acute brain conditions induced by the pharmacological action of psychedelics, increasing brain entropy and relaxing the precision weighting on priors, are ideal for working on the revision of high-level priors or beliefs. Consistent with recent work on the mechanics of insight, an entropic brain with relaxed high-level priors will be more amenable to curious behavior and Bayesian model optimization processes that can aid the occurrence of insight and perspective change. End quote. Okay, so the idea here, psychedelics increase entropy in the brain. They move you closer to criticality, that narrow window between order and chaos. At criticality, those high-level priors are relaxed. That allows them to change more easily. It allows you to break those deep ways that you're framing the world. And that means that high-level priors are your worldview questions, and that means that under the influence of psychedelics, we should be more apt to change our deep-seated assumptions about the world, and we do have evidence for this, empirical evidence for this. One of the most striking findings about psychedelics is that they change people's metaphysical beliefs, right? People's deep metaphysical beliefs about what the world is like at a fundamental level. And these changes typically involve a movement away from what you might call hard materialism. The hard materialism, is very sort of, I think it's a very silly kind of physicalism. We talked earlier about illusionism, right, in part 4. And Michael Graziano had this discussion of consciousness, and he said, well, you can't knock on it, or you can't scratch it, right, and therefore it's not real. Okay, that's that kind of hard materialism, which is a very silly way of thinking about things. But psychedelics move you away from that kind of hard materialism and towards, I would argue, generally speaking, less silly ways of thinking about the world. But so I'm going to read what Timmerman and colleagues said about this in a recent paper, 2021 paper. They said, and I quote, that the present study sought to test the hypothesis that psychedelic experiences mediate changes in metaphysical beliefs concerning the nature of reality, consciousness, and fate. Converging cross-sectional, prospective, observational, and controlled research data suggest a relationship between psychedelic experiences and shifts away from positions of hard physicalism and towards panpsychism, dualistic, and fatalistic beliefs. The observed changes were enduring, persisting for up to 6 months in most domains, with the exception of fatalistic determinism. Let me stop there for a second. I mean, that's an amazing finding in the context of psychology. Most psychological interventions don't do anything. And the ones that do anything, generally speaking, the effects are very short-lived and they die out very quickly. The fact that you can change people's fundamental beliefs about the world and that the effects persist for at least up to 6 months, that is, the fact, really that should be kind of earth-shattering for psychologists, given the total failure of psychological interventions to change anything for the entire history of psychology, basically. And there's some interventions that do a little bit, but for the most part, psychologists cannot change people's behavior. Psychedelics can, and they can, and they do so in a profound way. They go on to say, moreover, the large sample prospective / observational and smaller but well-controlled research sample findings converged, implying that psychedelic use may be a key causal determinant of the relevant shifts in metaphysical beliefs. Furthermore, the belief shifts were correlated with positive mental health changes, namely improvements in well-being in the observational data and depression scores in the controlled research data, end quote. That is also something that should be very important, that I think is extremely important. The fact that changing people's worldview can change their mental health status. This shouldn't be surprising. It shouldn't actually all be, it actually does matter, what you believe about the world, believe it or not. But, this is such an interesting finding to me. For one, psychedelics move people away from hard materialism, and they do so in a sustained way. So it lasts for a long time. And that movement away from hard materialism is associated with an increase in mental health and psychological well-being. That's very interesting, at the very least. So the fact that psilocybin affects high-level priors also makes it easier to understand why it can have long-lasting effects on personality. This is another one of these amazing findings with psychedelics, which is that it changes people's personality, and it does so in what is generally, I think, most people would regard as a positive way. And it does so in a way that lasts for a long time, which is, again, psychologists have been trying to do things like this forever, and they all fail. Psychedelics succeed. Psychologists should pay attention to this stuff if they have a brain. And it's really amazing to me the number of psychologists who don't care at all about this stuff. And I just have to think, I don't know, what's going on with you. So anyways, they say about this, Griffiths and colleagues say about this, and I quote, that in the present study, psilocybin was administered in the context of undertaking a non-sectarian program of meditation and other spiritual practices that emphasized integration of spiritual values in daily life. The study showed robust, interactive, positive effects of psilocybin dose and added support for spiritual practices on a wide range of longitudinal measures at 6 months, including interpersonal closeness, gratitude, life meaning and purpose, forgiveness, death transcendence, daily spiritual experiences, religious faith and coping, and rating of participants by community observers. Analyses suggest that the determinants of these effects were the intensity of the psilocybin-occasioned mystical experience and the rates of engagement with meditation and other spiritual practices, end quote. So if you look at the effect sizes on this stuff, the effect sizes are not trivial at all. If you go look at the data in this paper, I don't remember exactly what they were, but the effect sizes on these changes are not trivial. Right? They're substantial changes in people's personality that last for a long time. There's another one. I don't think I cite it in this presentation here, but people's ratings on the Big Five trait of openness to experience are increased by a substantial amount up to a year later after a mystical experience under psilocybin, which again, should not be possible under the normal assumptions of like regular psychology. Like generally speaking, personality traits are pretty stable over time, but psychedelics can change them. So we're now going to look at how there's evidence that one of the things that mediates these changes in people is the quality of the experience that they have while under the influence of psilocybin, and especially the sense of connectedness that they feel while they're under the influence of it. That this sense of connectedness mediates these changes. So Carhart Harris and colleagues in the 2018 paper review the evidence that the sense of connectedness under psilocybin is something that mediates the positive changes that it can induce. So they say about this, and I quote, that a sense of disconnection is a feature of many psychiatric disorders, particularly depression, and a sense of connection or connectedness is considered a key mediator of psychological well-being, as well as a factor underlying recovery of mental health. One of the most curious aspects of the growing literature on the therapeutic potential of psychedelics is the seeming general nature of their therapeutic applicability. That is, they have shown promise not just for the treatment of depression, but for addictions, anxiety, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. This raises the question of whether psychedelic therapy targets a core factor underlying mental health. We believe that it does, and that connectedness is the key. End quote. Now, what is that core factor that it's targeting really? Well, as far as I'm concerned, it's meaning. Right? Much of our psychopathology is a symptom of the meaning crisis, and psychedelics are intensely meaningful, and that has a healing effect for many people. Right? Just being shown, right? Because if you have had this experience, right, it's not like you can deny it, right? The meaning that you experience under the influence of a psychedelic drug is as real as it gets. And you can tell somebody, oh, that's just a delusion, or it's brain chemicals in your brain. And the general reaction to that is, well, how about you just go ahead and fuck off, because you have no idea if you haven't done it. You don't know. It's as real as it gets, right? This is one of the things, John Vervaeke talks about this quite a bit, what he calls the ontonormativity of it. Ontonormativity just meaning you don't get to say it's not real, right? If you've done it, that's not an option. It is as real as it gets. And it's also, it can't be considered a delusion in the normal sense, because delusions are psychopathological. But psilocybin use, generally speaking, under controlled settings, promotes psychological health. It's been used to treat psychiatric conditions. And so that's kind of the opposite of a delusion in the normal sense. Okay, so he says that connectedness is the key. So what is this connectedness that he's talking about? He says, and I quote, that connectedness, as it was described by patients in our treatment-resistant depression trial, encompassed not just connection to others, that is, social connectedness, in the world in general, for example, connectedness to nature, but also connection to the self. Post-treatment, participants referred to feeling reconnected to past values, pleasures, and hobbies, as well as feeling more integrated, embodied, and at peace with themselves in their often troubled backgrounds. It is a working hypothesis of ours that connection to self is a bedrock from which connection to others and the world can follow most naturally. End quote. I don't think there's any difference here between connectedness and integration, right? I think we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about internal and external integration, right? That's what, connectedness in this sense might as well be a synonym for integration in this context. So psilocybin works by increasing entropy in the brain, moving us closer to the border between order and chaos. And at that border, high-level beliefs, which can be thought of as these deep ways that we're framing the world, the answers that we have to the big questions, whether those are implicit or explicit, they become relaxed. And that allows us to break those frames and to form new ones, which is the same thing as having these deep systematic insights. And these insights result in an increased sense of connectedness to ourself, to others, and to the world around us. And that can be thought of, in my humble opinion, as being essentially the same thing as psychological integration, right? They promote psychological integration. And that's the mediating factor for their ability to help people to overcome psychopathology. And that's, that increase in integration is necessarily an increase in complexity as well. And that process, right, the process by which we temporarily disintegrate and reintegrate into a higher form of order, right, which is what happens under the psilocybin experience, at least in the ideal case. Now, let me be clear about this. Sometimes it can disintegrate you and you don't come back, right? So, that's a psychotic break essentially, and that has happened before under psilocybin and other psychedelics. I don't know of any examples under psilocybin in particular, but I know it's happened under other psychedelics. So it's not like there's no risk involved. Of course, there's always a risk involved anytime we're talking about phase changes, right? Like risk is a part of the game, but of course, there's no way to live without taking some kind of risk. But that process is felt as deeply meaningful, and that's because our participation in the process of complexification is deeply meaningful. We are participating in it when we are in the flow state, when we have these peak experiences, and when we are under the influence of psilocybin. Right? It's a somewhat artificial way of inducing what happens in that state, but it has functional benefits, at least when used correctly. So I'm going to read something that Jordan Peterson said about the instinct of meaning, because I think he's correct. I think he got it right. You can find this quote in this Akira the Dawn music video called "Pursue What Is Meaningful, Not What Is Expedient," and I recommend listening to that. It's really good. The link will be in the description. Jordan Peterson said, and I quote, that meaning is what you have to buttress yourself against the tragedy of life. Despite the fact that you are a fragile, damaged, mortal creature, you've found something to do that announced itself as worthwhile. That's meaning. It's an instinct. It's a deep, deep instinct. It's like a form of vision. Meaning tells you when you're in the right place, and the right place is between chaos and order. And those are real places. Your hemispheres. Your right hemisphere is roughly evolved to deal with things you don't understand. That's chaos. And your left hemisphere is there to deal with things you do understand. You can't just stay with things you do understand because you already understand them. And you can't stay with the things you don't understand because then you're lost. You need to be in the middle of those two. And you can tell when you're in the middle because everything lines up. Meaning says, I'm here where I should be. And you can't tell why. It's just that everything is right. You get this physiological sense of being in the right place at the right time. Follow this meaningful path. That's your buttress against the tragedy that produces resentment and malevolence. Meaning is the antidote to that. That's the fundamental religious truth. Life is suffering. That's true. There's malevolence. That's true. Meaning is the antidote to that. Yes. People say, well, meaning isn't real. It's like, no, that's wrong. It's actually the most real thing. It might even be more real than suffering and evil. That's possible. And this isn't a metaphysical assumption that I'm making. And you feel it. You feel it in your body. It's not just a mental thing. It's not an idea. It's a place. Because we are in time and space. A place is a place in 3 dimensions, but it's also a time. And when the place and the time are set up properly, you're in the right place, and your brain is telling you that. Your being is telling you that. The purpose of profound religious or philosophical contemplation is to learn how to be in the right place at the right time all the time. End quote. And that is the purpose of it, as far as I'm concerned. And this is something that's important to understand, right? Meaning is not an idea. It's in your body, right? You feel it in your body, right? It's embodied, right? When you're in the flow state, if you played sports, right, and you're in the zone, right, you're not in your head. Meaning is not in your head, right? It's in your gut, or in your, it's in your body. Yeah, I don't think I have anything else to say about that. I think that Jordan Peterson gets that 100% correct. So this is essentially what I think is going on, right? Like, order is the known, chaos is the unknown, and criticality, which is where meaning is felt, is the border between order and chaos, but it's where this process takes place, this process by which you are continually disintegrated and reintegrated into a higher level of complexity, which is a higher level of integration. That's what's happening in the flow state. That's what's happening in the peak experience. That's what happens under the influence of psychedelics. And that's what meaning is. It's the instinct that keeps you situated at that border between order and chaos. Right? That's what the function of it is. And when you are at that border, you are participating in the process by which you become more integrated over time. And it's the right place to be. And so the pursuit of meaning is the fundamental human pursuit in some sense, right? Everything else must be, or ought to be at least, subordinate to that. And when you are there, you are participating in the process of self-actualization. We'll talk about that in the next video. So to recap, flow states, peak experiences, and psychedelic experiences are all felt as intensely meaningful. And these are all felt as meaningful for the same basic reason. They all represent our participation in the process by which we become more integrated and more complex over time, which is represented by the metamythology. When we are participating optimally in that process, it is experienced as deeply meaningful. And so meaning is an instinct or a psychological adaptation, however you want to talk about it. And it's an instinct or psychological adaptation that guides us towards that border between order and chaos. And it tells us when we're in the right place. And the right place is to be optimally situated between the unknown and the known. And that's where we optimally achieve the integrated fulfillment of our biologically mediated values, right? Which is our fundamental motivations, which I think the list that Kenrick and colleagues made is a fine list, right? Despite the fact that they got rid of self-actualization when they shouldn't have. But that's where those biologically mediated values will be integrated, fulfilled in an integrated way, in at least the optimal way based on the limitations of your being a very limited creature. So that is it for video 2 of part 7. Hopefully that was useful in some way or another. And then in video 3 of part 7, we're going to talk about self-actualization and why it ought to go at the top of the hierarchy. And then we're also going to talk about, I think in the next video, we're going to talk about music as well, and why it is that music is felt as being deeply meaningful. So I will see you there. Goodbye.